Well, good afternoon. This is Susan Albertine speaking, and Becky Dolinsky may jump in at any minute to introduce the webinar, but I'm going to go right ahead and get us started because we're at the top of the hour. We are very glad that you've joined us. We have planned an hour-long webinar. There will be time for question and answer about 45 minutes from now, and we would urge you to use the chat function or the Q&A to, oops, I'm not seeing the webinar. I wonder if anybody else is seeing it. Jim, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. No,
okay.
It disappeared.
It looks like we lost people, but I'm assuming that they're going to get it back up and running and that others will, in fact, be hearing us right now. So I'm going to just keep going, and we'll treat it like a telephone webinar until we get our slides going again. You will see when the webinar gets running again that if you have a chat function or a Q&A function, please make use of it to put in questions. We will have time for those questions at the end. We are also going to make sure that this webinar is posted on the SHIO website. We posted the one that we did yesterday. This is the second of two on design. And we will put, whichever one comes out better, we will put up, and I'm hoping we'll have all the questions there so that you can listen to the questions. And the idea is that you should be able to use this webinar, download it, and use it at home, so it's kind of a do-it-yourself. I am Susan. Yes, I can hear you now.
Good. I was kicked off of the webinar for some odd reason. I'm happy to introduce. I don't know where you're at.
Okay. Well, it would be great if you would get the slides up so people can see them, because I'm not seeing them either, and I don't know whether others are able to see the slides. So I've just been telling them what we're doing.
You can't see the slides?
No.
I can see the slide, and this is Jim.
Jim, you can see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, all right. There's a tab there that says assignment design, and we're getting word from folks that they can see the slides on their end too.
Okay, so why don't I log myself back in, and as I'm doing that, maybe we'll go on. Becky, why don't you talk a little bit more about getting the thing started, and I'll see if I can get myself back in where I'm supposed to be.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I apologize, everyone. For some odd reason, I was kicked off the conference call, but I'm back on now, and I'm happy to introduce the webinar. So on behalf of the Association of American Colleges and Universities and the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on assignment design. This webinar is intended for all participants in the Multistate Collaborative to Advance Learning Outcomes Assessment Project and will be particularly useful to faculty members from institutions participating in the upcoming MSc pilot study. Today's webinar follows our recently scheduled webinars describing the MSc project and the pilot study, and will focus on the importance of intentionally linking assignment design to valuable assessment practices. Before we proceed, allow me to discuss a few technical points. We currently have all participants muted to reduce background noise. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment, you can unmute yourself during the Q&A portion at the end of this webinar by clicking the microphone icon next to your name. Or you can use the raise hand icon and we'll unmute you. You can also use the Q&A chat function at any time during the webinar to send questions directly to the host and presenters, and we will pose your question once the webinar panelists have completed their presentation. Please send any technical questions directly to the host of the webinar, Manka Nguatu, and she can chat with you directly. This session is being recorded and will be posted so that others may review it. Please let us know if you wish to ask a question off the record. So, Monka, if you would move to the next slide, I'll introduce Susan and Jim. So I would now like to introduce our panelists for the MSc webinar on assignment design. Susan Albertine, Vice President for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Student Success at AAC&U, who you already heard from, and James Gubbins, Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Salem State University. Susan and Jim are also members of the MSc Faculty Engagement Subgroup. Susan, are you back on?
I am. I'm happy to say I am back on and ready to go.
And you can see the slides?
I can. So everything is good. Let me say a little bit more about myself. I work at AAC&U now, but most of my career I was an English professor and an English language arts middle school teacher and high school teacher. So I've been teaching composition for many decades. And in recent years, I've also been working quite extensively in undergraduate public health education, and that is actually related to my interest in the topic of this webinar. Jim and I, as you will learn, are both humanists. I'm a 19th century Americanist. He's a philosopher and teaches religious studies. He'll tell you more about that. But we wanted to work on a challenging assignment design webinar for the MSc, and so we figured we'd have a couple of humanists going after quantitative literacy and see what we could do with that. So that's our approach, and I'm happy to hand the mic, so to speak, over to Jim to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Jim Gubbins. I'm currently a faculty member at Salem State University. I've been doing assessment work for around 10 years. I've been working at the state, the campus, and the national level. In 2008, my institution participated in the Wabash National Study, and then after that I became a Teagle Assessment Scholar in 2010. I've always thought of my assessment work as a kind of moral endeavor. We're working together to help our students to have good lives where they will flourish and they will help those around them flourish and the broader community do well, so that they will be better citizens, better colleagues, better in all kinds of ways. So it's really, in my book, a kind of moral venture that we're involved with in assessment. Susan?
Okay. How about if we go to the next slide? Jim and I spent some time talking together about why assignment design matters. You know, why does it matter? Why are we doing this? And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about that and then hand it over to Jim to talk about some experiences he's had. The first reason to do it is that it's good for student learning, and it's really important to make that case and say that and come back to it constantly. It really is all about student learning. When you're intentional in putting together assignments for your students, you're giving them an opportunity to demonstrate that they've achieved the outcomes that you want them to demonstrate. Doesn't happen randomly so well. Happens much better when it's intentional. So that's first and foremost. I know we're on a sponsored project, but we're really about student learning and figuring out better ways to get there. One of the wonderful things about the assignment design part of this project is that it supports faculty engagement in group activity. It encourages you, and I hope you'll experiment with this, to develop a community of practice on your campus for student success through faculty engagement. So if you're more intentional about the design of your assignment, it makes it easier to join your colleagues in asking the same questions about intentionality and learning outcomes for their students. So we think you can actually have a good time getting together to work on this project. And if you do that, you're going to strengthen your programs, bring all kinds of benefits to your particular program, the broader curriculum, maybe Gen Ed, as well as major programs, and all your institutional efforts on behalf of student achievement. You'll see lots of ways you might not have thought of to move from a kind of mindset that focuses on my course to a mindset that focuses on our curriculum and our graduates. And finally, this intentional assignment design can help you make the critical connection between assessment that's really genuinely rooted in your work and the students' work and the design and the teaching practices. So, and in this project, you can't really do the assessment without it. That is, if the designs aren't there, you're going to have trouble with the assessment. Now, I would say that's always true, but this project is really going to drive that home, I'm sure. Our webinar suggests that you take a shortcut, that we're trying to give you some ideas about how others have learned from working on intentional designs. If you're intentional from the start as you design or tweak an assignment, you will do better. And I want to say, maybe you're not going to design from the ground up. Maybe you're going to take an assignment that already exists and change it to have more quantitative reasoning in it. And that's one of the recommendations. If that assignment doesn't aim to help students achieve quantitative reasoning outcomes, there's no way you're going to be able to assess it. It's just not going to work, and it won't work for the project. But there are some things you can do so that you will be able to assess it, and great bonus, everybody's going to do better if we all do this kind of work together. So the 4 things you need, really, to start is your assignment or an idea for an assignment, a piece of student work associated with that assignment, a rubric, we're going to look at the value quantitative literacy rubric, and other people. Some people think that the best way to do this sort of work is the organic way. Start with a piece of student work, maybe not a perfect one, and look at it. It's a great icebreaker. So look at a piece of student work that intends to get at some kind of quantitative literacy and work backwards from there to design an assignment that will make sense in your course or in your program. Work in a community of practice. You can always, of course, start with a rubric and build the assignment from there. But whichever way you go, you really need to know in advance what you value about quantitative literacy and what you hope students will be able to do. That's really key. Now, we're going to use in this webinar a couple of examples of simple seeming single problem student work products and suggest that you embed such problem-based activities in a multi-dimensional assignment for quantitative literacy. So I'm going to hand it over to Jim to give you some background, and then we'll go from there. And we have the next slide. Good.
Right. These dates are key dates that relate to what's been going on in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has been working on developing a statewide system of student learning assessment beginning in January of 2010. Since then, the state has built a community of practice focused on student assessment and student learning, which includes the full range of Massachusetts higher education institutions, from the community colleges to the state universities to the various University of Massachusetts campuses. One component of this initiative was a pilot study conducted in 2013. The purpose of the study was to test a model for statewide assessment by collecting student artifacts, that is, student work products, and assessing them using common assessment tools, the value rubrics. The 3 learning outcomes identified for assessment in this pilot study were critical thinking, quantitative literacy, and written communication. The goal was to collect 25 artifacts per skill from each campus. The target date for collecting student work for the pilot study was a little over a year ago. That was March 15th, 2013. Next slide. We in Massachusetts learned a great deal from the pilot study, and that learning has been incorporated into this multi-state collaborative pilot study. What worked in Massachusetts is being duplicated in the multi-state study, and what was a problem is being addressed. In fact, this webinar was created to address one major problem. Now, here's a little clip from an email to me from one of my colleagues who did some scoring. She wrote, "I spent almost a whole day scoring the quantitative literacy artifacts. It did not go well for multiple reasons. Many of the artifacts weren't appropriate for this rubric. They were simple math quizzes. Put simply, the student work didn't demonstrate the quantitative literacy learning outcomes because the assignments weren't designed with that purpose in mind. Our hope in the Multi-State Collaborative is that by giving faculty the opportunity to study the quantitative literacy value rubric this early in the process will mean that faculty will have time to consider changing their assignments so they fit the rubric better and will be better able to be assessed. While scoring student artifacts in quantitative literacy was a bit frustrating, those faculty in Massachusetts who scored student work and those who didn't score but who had just gone to one of the workshops on value rubrics came away with a near consensus view, which is studying and using the value rubrics had a large and positive impact on how they view their own assignments. They now are more deliberate in choosing learning outcomes and designing assignments in which students can practice and show they've achieved the particular learning outcomes they're interested in. Massachusetts teachers have been hard at work determining the learning outcomes they find most worthwhile. 2 K-16 initiatives, PARC, which stands for Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, and Core to College, are aimed at ensuring that college-bound students are college-ready. Representatives of the Massachusetts K-12 system and from the higher ed system have come together to agree on a working definition for college readiness in mathematics. This working definition is the culmination of many conversations dominated by teachers on quantitative literacy. Now, the quantitative literacy value rubric has offered Massachusetts another touchstone, this time for college faculty to assess college-level learning. In October of 2012, faculty and administrators from across the Massachusetts higher ed system joined together at a statewide conference on quantitative literacy. The quantitative literacy value rubric was examined and then used to score samples of student work. A lively conversation on math competency ensued that has continued on and off to this day. The difference, though, between then and now is that most faculty who have used the quantitative literacy value rubric recognize that it provides a good framework for understanding, discussing, and assessing college-level quantitative literacy. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is Susan, and I would like to have us spend just a couple of minutes thinking about this value rubric, quantitative literacy. I think if you're at home, you should be able to get it to be large enough where you can actually read it. You probably know it. We will have some time to answer some questions about it at the end. We're going to come back to it and look at it again, but I just wanted to say a few things about it. You may have questions, I'll add that Ashley Finley's with us, and at the end she can jump in and talk about the rubric too. The main things you want to remember as you're working with your colleagues, you definitely want to emphasize, is that in the left-hand column, there are a set of criteria. There's 6 dimensions of learning. There are abilities that are associated with quantitative literacy. And the columns are arranged so that you move from the highest level, the capstone 4, and across to what would be considered benchmarks. So the levels are those columns. And we often say that the benchmark represents about where students ought to be when they start college, 2-year or 4-year, and the capstone ought to be a culminating experience. But those levels really are not intended individually to show years in college. Students learn in a much more complex way. Now, in the cells associated with each of the criteria, you see performance level descriptors. These are descriptions of performance. So the capstone for interpretation provides accurate explanations of information presented in mathematical forms. Now, I, as an English professor, somebody from the humanities, look at this thing and I might start, and I actually did start, quaking in my boots. I mean, all my degrees are in English, and the big terror for me is that right in the middle is that dread range called calculation. And I think, I'm not sure I can do that. But I want to persuade you that I can, that I've learned that I can. And the reason is that the calculation is all embedded in a set of other learning criteria that are actually very, very attractive to me as an English professor. Interpretation, representation, communication, work on assumptions, those are things I can do. And maybe I can figure out ways of working with college-level calculation that will really be good for my students. And I think the same is true if you're from a highly technical field. How can you embed calculation in a plan for communication? That might be a question that you haven't asked before. So working with the rubric is a really good way to go to figure out how to embed a quantitative assignment with some calculation in it inside of something that you are already doing that pushes you beyond your comfort zone and is good for students. And I would say that anybody from any discipline can do this really well. I would, in fact, challenge you and your colleagues to give it a try. Now, Jim is going to give you some examples of problems that might be used in an embedded way to get to this outcome of quantitative literacy. So if we go to the next slide, Jim can take over.
This is a wonderful assignment from an exam that consisted entirely of problems derived from newspaper articles. Here we have a New York Times story of a Picasso painting being auctioned off by Sotheby's. The student is then asked about how the auctioneer's commission was calculated and whether the numbers in the article are correct. Next slide. Now we see the student's work. The student has converted the article's mix of numbers and verbal explanations into pure numerical calculations. The student also adds his or her final verbal judgment regarding the article's accuracy. The NYT, the New York Times, was correct. Next slide. So this one question or assignment requires a student to demonstrate the skills described by the second and third criteria from the quantitative literacy rubric. The student's skill in representation is shown. The student converts the words and numbers in the article into numerical equations. The student also demonstrates skill in calculation. Next slide, please. This is another assignment from the same exam. It has to do with how the cost to the U.S. Mint for producing a penny coin exceeds the actual face value of the 1-cent penny coin. This time, the student is required to demonstrate their abilities in the first criterion in the quantitative literacy rubric, which is interpretation. The student needs to interpret what's going on in these two graphs and to relate the graphs to each other. Next slide, please. Here are the actual questions. Questions A through C ask the student to demonstrate skills in the first three criteria: interpretation, representation, and calculation. Next slide, please. The student needs to interpret the graphs, that is, make sense of the information there. Through words and equations, the student explains what's going on in the graphs. the student is also representing information from the graph in alternate form. That is, turning graph information into sentences and numerical equations. And of course, the student is also demonstrating skill in calculation. These two questions I've been discussing are not from my classes, but I have asked students in my humanities classes to demonstrate quantitative literacy. For example, in my comparative religion class, I've asked my students to make sense of some of the claims regarding the number of adherents to different religions around the world. Around 31% of the global population is identified as Christian, while 23% is Muslim. At the same time, Islam is claimed to be the fastest growing religion. Then I asked my students what would need to happen for Islam to overtake Christianity, and then you take into account the rate of growth in different parts of the world, who's living in those parts, are they Muslim, are they Christian, how is conversion going on, what about fertility in those areas. It's interesting, and it's definitely quantitative, and it's about religion in the world. Also, in a first-year seminar class, I had students study and discuss NESI results, which I didn't know could be so interesting for students. It was a kind of experiment I did with our institutional research person. And I had the students compare the behaviors of seniors with those of first-year students. I asked them, what can you make of the fact that seniors on average work more hours for pay and also spend more time studying than first-year students? Are the students getting more busy and more responsible over the years? Or, and this actually relates to the fifth criterion, assumptions. Could it be that the seniors are actually a different population? Are they actually more dedicated students from the beginning who have remained in school, while those who were not dedicated as first-year students are no longer at the institution? What's going on here? How do those numbers relate? What are the assumptions we're making? What are the facts behind that? Next slide, please, Susan.
Thanks, Jim. Those were really great examples. So I want to bring us back to look at the rubric again, having seen those example problems. What we're hoping is that you could use those example problems and think up an activity that includes some calculation, that includes as well some of the other criteria, no matter what your field, and that you can do that well. So what are ideas that you might have for an assignment that you could devise or tweak? And to think that way, you might want to consider looking at, say, the New York Times in your field, or for stories that have a quantitative base that's related to your field. And you might get all sorts of things. I myself, in my work on public health, when I was still teaching, figured out ways that I could approach 19th century literary history using population data. And it opened up a whole new world for me, I have to say. I mean, I was a pretty garden variety 19th century Americanist, but I know a lot about industrialization. And I wanted to figure out what happens when industrialization starts to affect people's lives. Well, all kinds of things happen. I mean, there's a huge increase in air pollution from coal smoke, for one thing. And so one of the things you can do with students, if you're looking at the 19th century, is get them to figure out what's happening to people under industrialization. And it turns out there are a lot of early, really, really interesting census documents that you can use, and they might even find, as we did, that life expectancy starts to plateau through industrialization. What a fascinating thing. And then you can start asking questions about that. But the other thing you get from it, and I found this was very powerful for my students, they had no idea what it would mean to have a high child mortality rate and how that might relate to the loss of many children, might relate to the way you write stories, the way you write poetry. nor did they have a sense of what it meant to be looking at a life expectancy of age 40, which was still the case in the U.S. in 1900. So what I'm suggesting is that as I push myself as a literary scholar beyond my comfort zone and start thinking about how students might go and get quantitative information and present it and interpret it within the context of my course, I open up all kinds of possibilities. And it starts to be fun, actually, and interesting to join your colleagues. This is a chance for me to network with my other colleagues in the social sciences. I actually did do that, and especially people in statistics to help me figure out new approaches. Now, in the context of this project, you may be wondering, look at all those criteria. Does my tweaked or my brand new assignment have to meet all 6 of those criteria? Well, that's maybe hard for some of you, but we think you should aim to meet as many of them as you can. We're in a pilot phase of a project, and we are totally aware of how unusual this is. But if you aim to address more of the criteria using conversion of information or presentation of an argument with a quantitative basis as well as calculation, that'll be much more likely to yield results that we can assess and learn from, but also that'll be really good for your students. And you may want to ask some questions about that. We would be very happy to come back to those questions later. Jim, do you want to add anything else before I go on to the next slide?
I would like to make one general comment, which is every time I've worked with a value rubric, I've worked with several different ones in my classes, I've discovered that they pushed me further to really articulate to myself and to my students what I'm looking for. And I realized, for instance, these 2, application and assumption on quantitative literacy, a number of times when writing an assignment, when grading an assignment, we're thinking about that, but when you look back at the assignment, it really doesn't ask for anything about assumptions or ask exactly how a student should be applying the knowledge that they picked up in class. And so then, of course, sometimes the student work is brilliant, and sometimes it's lacking, but it's not lacking because the student can't do it. Maybe they just weren't asked for it in the assignment, or they haven't really been doing it in class. And so as we look at the rubrics, start thinking about our assignments and our teaching in terms of them, it may add something really new and interesting that we value. And in the creation of these are the kinds of things faculty from across the country have said, this is valuable. Susan?
Thank you. That was great. Okay, if you would go to the next slide. This, we're hoping, might be of some help to you. It's a new tool that we've started working with. It was developed by a group of faculty. I thought they were biologists, but it turns out they were mathematicians in Kentucky in the Degree Qualifications Profile Quality Collaboratives project. And they were working in a faculty professional development collaborative with Gary Brown, who's one of our colleagues, and working with us on projects at AAC&U. And they came up with this idea of a scaffolding pyramid, and I thought it was really smart, and it might help you think about embedding this assignment that you're thinking of and your colleagues are thinking of, embedding it in something that's bigger, that goes beyond the atomized moment of the assignment and builds towards something for the student that we could think of as mastery. And so what they did, I think this is really quite wonderful, is they took the criteria from the value rubric, and you can see them in the black bar. Now, in the design here, they put representation and communication together, so you'll see it comes out as 5 criteria rather than 6. I think I want to play with it and get another criterion in there. But there they are, and then I added, just for illustration, under those criteria, some of those performance level descriptors, the learning statements that are at the capstone level. So if you want to help your students work on interpretation that includes numbers, you're wanting to get to a point where they can provide accurate explanations of information that's in mathematical form and skillfully convert and argue for the purpose of that work. Now, they're not going to do that immediately. So what the design of this pyramid, I think, is really kind of cool, because you could imagine where your assignment in the class that you're working on fits in the pyramid. And notice it's not done by class year, but you might be working on interpretation and calculation at a very basic level. But if you look up the pyramid, it all comes together in that wonderful triangle that's at the top that says mastering, where the skills are no longer discrete and the criteria are no longer 6, they're 1. And they'll come together at a higher level. And it's possible to think intentionally about how you build not just one assignment, but lots of assignments across the criteria over time and get to mastery. And you may find this kind of schematic helpful to you when you're working together in a group on your assignments for this project. So I asked myself a key question. Look at the criteria. If I want a student to master quantitative literacy, she needs to do what's at the base of the pyramid in a concentrated, culminating effort at the capstone point, when she finishes her associate's degree or she finishes her baccalaureate degree. And if I can start thinking about the component elements of that learning into parts and build on it, I can help her get there. I'd like now to have the next slide, and I want to show you what this group of faculty in Kentucky did. We don't have time to go into this, but I thought it was really pretty amazing. They spent a whole day, and you can see the quantitative value rubric criteria, and then they actually used and embedded the Kentucky Essential Learning Outcomes that are aligned with the DQP, the Degree Qualifications Profile, and they put those at the base, and then they started thinking as a group about their program, starting with students who were in developmental math. This was a group of 2-year and 4-year colleagues working in mathematics, as now I'm getting all my details right. But if you study this diagram, you see the idea of the students developing math learning and also getting an introduction to service learning. And as you go up the pyramid, you get to the point where they've actually gotten some fairly significant quantitative skills, and they're also able to use those skills for a community service project. It's quite wonderful. So you could think about this using the quantitative literacy rubric, or you could use integrative learning. But the idea was that the students were developing skills, and you see the picture on the bicycle, growing and learning until they get to the top. And the other thing about this diagram that I think is so wonderful is it actually tries to capture and convey how people learn, which is not a linear thing. It's a complex thing that of advancement and integration. So we hope that will be helpful to you. There is a Word version of it that you can play with, and we'd be happy to share that with people if you would like it. How about if we move to the next slide? And we have, Jim and I wanted to give you some basic guidelines, and you might want to return to these and discuss them on your campus. So let me start by reiterating, you really need to know where you want to go. What is the key outcome that you want? And for working in quantitative literacy, that's a big outcome that almost, I guess, everybody wants to have, but very few know how to get to. But if you start thinking about those criteria on the value rubric, then you might have a better idea of an approach to that outcome that you want, but you have to keep the outcome in mind. Where's the student going? What's going to happen to the way the student thinks quantitatively? We do want to urge you to consider how you could tweak an existing assignment, and by putting in some problem-based activities that might look like some the examples that Jim gave, or some of the other examples that we talked about, so that you're not totally upsetting yourself, but you're able to work in an incremental way with what you know you can do and push into a new area. It always helps to consider how an assignment is developmental, how what you do in one case contributes to a student's grasp of a learning outcome of quantitative literacy over time. And as that pyramid suggests, it really is helpful if you analyze the criteria, and Jim suggested this too, to figure out key components for an assignment that works in your field. Again, I strongly suggest looking at a newspaper. It's a great way to get started. Work with the New York Times. Some of their interactive or their animated graphs and charts are pretty astonishing. But you can also work backwards from a student artifact, preferably do it in a group, get a piece of work, go backwards, put that value rubric on the side, and consider looking also at the degree qualifications profile for some of the learning statements there that are keyed to associate and baccalaureate and master's degree levels. It helps a lot. And Jim, I'm doing all this talking. Would you like to jump in and do these other two?
One thing I would just like to add is that when you look at the quantitative literacy value rubric, it looks like it might be complex, it's a lot, but when you start to think about it, what is it we want our students to do out in the world? And it really is taking information that is best understood quantitatively and putting it into numbers, into equations, into graphs in order to analyze it, use it, make judgments, and the other side where you have something that's numerical or something that's in some kind of standard mathematical form, and take that, try to interpret it, understand it, and use it. And so the rubric really lays out what we want, but it analyzes it into separate components. But this is what we want our students to do, and I guess picking up on progressive, thinking about our students working progressively and scaffolding their work. If we just get stuck on the calculation part, that's a problem, because calculations can get very sophisticated and sometimes they're not very applicable. What really is needed by a lot of our students is to be able to move from the domain of pure mathematics to the real world. And what we're learning, if you study developmental psych, is people tend to not convert things from one domain to another, from one context to another. And this is really helping students take that learning and converting it to different contexts, but we need to do it progressively. We can't just have them jump in and do some sophisticated math in some different setting. We need to figure out where the students are, and through assignments and through the classes, scaffold their work so that we know where they are and we can help them move to the next step. Susan?
Yeah, that was really nicely put. Often we use the term scaffolding to apply to the way you build a particular assignment itself, and think about the components of and elements of the learning in that one assignment, but we're suggesting that you think more broadly about learning over time and really focus practically on what students are going to be doing later in their lives. I think it's really important. I don't often tell stories about my own kids, but I have a son who was ready for multivariate calculus when he started college, And he didn't end up going into math, but he had to come home and ask for some help in figuring out how to handle a spreadsheet for a budget. And I thought, gosh, should have been able to figure that out, but he just hadn't had a whole lot of opportunities. So, you know, think in terms of what they're going to need in ways of manipulating money when they get out, and relate that to just the practical daily life, and then come back to your discipline, and it may help you think about it in a different way. I guess that's the kind of thinking that gets you ready, or helps them get ready for the days after graduation. How about if we go to our last slide before the questions? These are, as you'll see in just a minute when they come up, just our basic recommendations to remind you, have a good time with this. Collaborate. Don't do it alone. Try to think structurally about the elements in an assignment, about developmental learning, about a student's progress through the curriculum, and the complex ways in which learning can come together when they finish and get ready to go out in the world. Think beyond your discipline, no matter what that discipline is. And that's really important if you come from a field that's heavily quantitative. I think that it's very helpful, and as the older I get, the harder it is to do, to try and get back to novice thinking. And one of the things I really like about working with quantitative literacy is that it becomes extremely easy for me to behave like a novice when it comes to calculation, because I never had to take math in college, not a day of it. I placed out. So it's decades since I've done calculus. So I kind of get that, but I'm also able to say to myself, I think I can go out and talk to my colleagues in math, get some ideas about how I can change my industrialization course so that they're doing more work with numbers and that I learn a bit more. And then finally, talk to your students. We often forget this, but one of the very best things you can do is to ask them about how they're learning. And maybe, Jim, you might want to jump in. This is really key to understanding about transfer of learning, their reflection on it. Do you want to add anything to that before we turn to questions?
The one thing I wanted to add is that I do use not the value rubrics themselves, but modified rubrics in my courses with a number of my assignments so that the students have clear in their mind what I'm looking for. And we actually discuss the assignments and the rubrics before they do them so that we're very clear. And so the process is extremely transparent. And we all know what we're looking for, what we're expecting. And then if the students don't get something on the first assignment, I can give them feedback, and then the next assignment, which will have the same rubric, then they'll have a better idea. So a lot of this is really just getting clear about the outcomes that we want, making it clear to ourselves, making it clear to our students, getting clear in the work we do in the class and with our colleagues. Susan?
That's very nice. So why don't we go to the final slide, which you'll see has some upcoming webinars, and it's time for questions. So I will invite Becky to come back in and lead us through the questions, and I hope that Ashley's able, she may be still on. If she is, I think she'll jump in. So, Becky, you ready to take over?
Sure, and we just unmuted Ashley, made her a panelist, and so at this point we're not seeing any questions from the participants, so I would like to invite folks to either use the raise hand icon and we can unmute you so you can ask a question directly, or use the Q&A chat function or the other chat function to pose a question, and we'll be glad to read it out loud to everybody listening in.
Maybe we did such a good job that we won't have the questions we had yesterday. But there were a couple of questions yesterday that we were trying to address today on the way through. One of them came from someone in a technical or an engineering field. You know, well, we're really good at all of this, and I know that's true. We talked, though, a bit about how interesting that challenge becomes when people in highly technical fields really take seriously the communication of the highly technical information to a non-specialized audience. And so that we thought that might be a really good way to approach the challenge if you're coming from a highly quantitative field. Jim, do you want to recall anything from yesterday's Q&A while we're seeing if others have questions?
Well, one thing that did come up is whether the Multistate Collaborative would use any math problems. Math is not the issue. If it's just calculation, just equations, that doesn't really demonstrate representation, analysis, and application. However, at my institution, one of the math faculty members showed me some wonderful assignments where there are these word problems, there are graphs, and the students are required to then write in verbal form what's going on, what their judgments are about what's going on, doing some calculations. So it's really not the field, it's really the assignment. I think it would be really helpful for those who might use a lot of just math equations to actually ask their students to then explain what's going on or to represent the mathematical issue or problem in various forms, whether it's a table or a graph, something like that. And I didn't show them here, but there are just really wonderful examples from a math professor, and they touch on almost all the criteria.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I was recently working on a campus, one of the Cal State system campuses. I was at Chico, and I was doing a student focus group with a group that included some engineers, and I asked them how they thought we ought to assess their learning in college. I gave them, you know, a kind of prompt: be creative, think about the best way to assess what you've learned. And one of these people, a guy, put his hand up and he said, you know, I went and did some work at a middle school, and I actually got really happy and excited because I was able to convey my passion for engineering and physics and translate it to something that middle school kids could think is really cool. And he went on to explain what was keeping the building up around us. It was so wonderful. But I thought, you know, there's a challenge. That's a really great challenge. And so thinking about that aspect of quantitative literacy, I think, is really useful. Ashley, would you like to jump in and say anything at this point, since I know I believe you're out there?
So this is Becky, and I don't want to cut Ashley off at all, but I do want to alert you both to the fact, or the three of you, to the fact that there are a couple of questions out there. So Ashley, go ahead, please chime in, and then we'll read out the questions.
That sounds great. Thanks, Becky.
No, I think she's saying go for the questions.
Okay. Becky, did you want to read the questions?
Sure. I wanted to invite you to say something if you wanted to first, but I'm glad to go ahead and just read the questions.
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. So we'll start with the first one, which is, what data supports the belief that this is good for student learning?
Wow. Well,
It's a great question. This is Ashley, and thanks to Susan and Jim for putting together such a nice webinar. I'll just take a jump in here because I saw the question pop up, and it's a good one. I guess the question back to this question is exactly what the this is. And I'm not sure what exactly that means, but if we're talking about direct assessment of student learning, if we're talking about broad learning outcomes, we're thinking about all of the rubrics were loosely based on Bloom's taxonomy, theories of learning in which students are building cognitive skills over time by applying different kinds of demonstrations of learning, reapplying things in new contexts, thinking about what are basic cognitive skills and then building those over time. That's what we're thinking about when at least the rubrics were developed and the kind of assessment that we're looking at. What we're trying to do is ask good questions about moving beyond content only as a source of what we're thinking about with regard to student learning, looking beyond knowledge or not those things are very important, but moving beyond knowledge-based information to also skill-based.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Ashley. I mean, there was a time when we thought that learning was a matter of filling up empty heads with information, and that's not the way people learn. Everything that we have discovered through cognitive science over the last 25 years has suggested something much more complex and interactive, and we really did try to put together the value rubrics with reference to the best we can know about adult development or young adult development. There was an advisory board that had people who really understood cognition. So I guess that it gets back to Ashley's comment. It depends on what this is. And maybe the person who asked the question would like to refine it a bit more, or maybe we can go on to the other question.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to read out the other question. In our state's MSc pilot, 8 of 10 institutions are community colleges. To what levels in the rubrics should their assignments be targeted? Capstone means different things for associate and bachelor's degrees, of course.
Well, that's a really good one. Let me start and then see if others want to jump in. We've been doing a lot of work at AAC&U with community college partners around the country, and I will actually point to Middlesex Community College in Massachusetts and some of the work that they did with the rubrics on that question. They were Middlesex is working with UMass Lowell and on an intentional kind of transfer curriculum. And what they found is that the community college students were actually performing at about level 3 when they were doing their best, and some of them were doing better than that, which means that the community college students were actually performing at a level that you might have expected at the baccalaureate. Now, that won't be true for all students, and I know that many community colleges have a majority of students who are in developmental learning. I would say, however, that if you are guided by the rubrics and some of the best of the knowledge that we now have about developmental learning, you can do some accelerated work that will help the students get to that benchmark. I know I'm compressing a lot, but this has been a big theme in our developing a community college roadmap project at AAC&U. We've got lots of resources on that, and I would say figure out where your students are and work with them. That's my answer. Ashley, Jim, you want to add to that?
Susan, I think you did a fabulous job of answering that. It's pretty much exactly how I would have.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Don't get constrained. Yeah.
So any other questions, Becky, that you're seeing?
It looks like there may be another question. Let's see if we can get to that question with enough time. It looks like there's a follow-up to that first question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I know you were seeking clarification. Is there data that shows QL improves through the use of assignment design linked to rubrics? Do the students improve, and how do you know they have?
Yeah. Again, so that is a helpful follow-up. And I don't know that a campus has been intentional enough to link a process of assignment design, which would essentially be faculty development process, intentionally targeted assignment design with increasing levels of improvement with rubrics. What we do know, and I would direct everyone's attention to a series of 12 case studies that we have on our AAC&U website that are written by campuses having used rubrics, they use them using and highlighting the improvement process of how they've implemented rubrics, worked with faculty development, and then targeted the learning improvement process over time. What we do know is campuses that have worked with rubrics have been able to track students' improvement. I don't know if they haven't really isolated that to intentional assignment design, aspects of faculty development, faculty's improvement of working with the rubrics. I think there's lots of variables there, but that's what we're learning, at least from campuses, that it's been a useful process to be intentional about how the assignment design process goes, and then also to make sure that faculty have gone through training processes to work with the rubric. So both of those things matter.
Jim, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, one thing that has been well documented is that students in different disciplines either increase or decrease in some of these key skills over time. For instance, engineers have been, I think this was an academically adrift, maybe some other studies too, about engineers whose written communication skills have declined, and students majoring in education have over time declined in their quantitative literacy, because though these are key learning outcomes, they often have curricula that do not keep reinforcing or improving these skills. And so we know that without deliberate practice and work at improving these key skills, that they do decline. So there's a lot of data out there that relates to this, but I can't think of anything in particular that might be the perfect study.
Well, we are, in fact, in this pilot project to see if we can be more intentional ourselves in higher education, and we've got folks in 9 states who are trying. I mean, that, if you go back to the big purpose of the Multistate Collaborative, I think you'll see that that's one of the things we're trying to get at. This project is intended to bring together a large-scale collaborative of faculty across the country. We've got people in 9 states to figure out and get some of those data to show how students are learning in college, and to do this because as an alternative, as a robust alternative to standardized testing. And everything, all the work that we've been doing on the LEAP campaign has come back to that, the idea that, that we can do our best for students if we engage them in multiple ways over time and do it intentionally. And we're being asked to prove it, and this project gives us a chance to do it. But there's a lot of good scholarship, good research on engaged learning, and I would say that active use of quantitative literacy throughout the curriculum is a really, really important way to engage students, and we know that that does pay off. So we hope that the project's going to show that people can do the assessment work and can get the answers to some of those questions and share the results. And we believe that that's going to make a big difference for higher education. Becky, did you have any other questions, or are we ready to call it an afternoon or a day or the end of the hour?
There are no more questions. Well, hold on. I maybe too soon. Oh, not a question, but a comment. So I'm going to read this out. And then I also want to make sure I take a couple minutes to call everybody's attention to the next set of webinars. So let me read this comment out, give you an opportunity to respond. It's a comment for the panelists. Okay, so you don't need to read it out loud then. Okay. All right, so we'll just go on and actually I'm going to point everyone's attention toward the next set of MSc webinars. So we'll be holding 2 webinars next week on sampling for the pilot study. Also, and when I read these out, these webinars are all duplicates of the same content. So there'll be 2 webinars on sampling for the pilot study, exact same webinars. Also, 2 different dates held for a webinar on IRB and student consent in the multi-state assessment. And then we'll be also doing a webinar on the value rubrics. We have not set those dates yet, so please look ahead to your inboxes to receive those dates. And same with the task stream webinar on coding, formatting, and submitting artifacts. We have not set those dates yet either, but those webinars will probably be held in the late summer. Sheila's already posted Welcome to the MSc and the Pilot Study Overview webinars. And this assignment design webinar, we'll be posting one of these hopefully by the end of the week, if not early next week at the absolute latest.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. This has been a really productive hour, so thank you so much.
Yes, thanks to everyone for attending.
And we'll see you next time. Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.